Hello and welcome to Inside Politics. I'm Anastasia Lavrina. This week, the spotlight is on Hague, where the NATO summit has taken an unexpected shift in direction. While support for Ukraine remains, a standing issue is no longer the centerpiece. Instead, urgent developments in the Middle East have surged to the top of the agenda. The recent flare-up between Israel and Iran, including direct military strikes, has alarmed Western leaders. In response, the United States moved swiftly, positioning missile defense systems, naval assets, and additional forces in the region to contain further escalation. A ceasefire is currently in place, but the situation remains fragile. Any misstep could reignite hostilities. European leaders, particularly from Britain, France, and Germany, are calling for de-escalation and renewed diplomatic engagement with Tehran. As these events unfold, NATO is being forced to reassess its strategic priorities. The question now is how to maintain unity and credibility while addressing threats both in Eastern Europe and across the Middle East. Coming up, we will break down what this realignment means for the alliance and hear how regional actors are responding to NATO's changing role. Joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Peter Rove, political analyst and writer for Newsweek magazine. We're welcome to Inside Politics.
Hello, it's good to be with you.
Thank you very much. So this year's NATO summit in Hague is already being called as a historic. How do you think, what makes this summit different?
Somebody stuck a label on it and says, this is different, this is historic. And they'll do it with the next one, and they did it with the last one. It's important that NATO leaders meet. What's interesting about this summit is it's an opportunity for the NATO nations to start thinking creatively about what their role is in the 21st century. NATO was created for one specific reason: to keep Russian tanks out of Western Europe after World War II. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. The Berlin Wall has now been down for almost twice as long as it was up. NATO hasn't redefined its mission. NATO must redefine its mission. It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the last time I looked at the map, the Middle East isn't anywhere near the North Atlantic. So if they want to play globally, if they want to be the European presence around the world, they've got to decide what they're doing. What's happened over the last week between Israel, the United States, and Iran gives them an opportunity to say, hey, the world is changing and we want to be part of the change.
Well, Mr. Rove, that's very interesting. You said that NATO was created after the Second World War with the aim to allow the Russian tanks, but most probably the Soviet tanks, to come closer to Eurozone, to Europe.
I should have said Soviet tanks, but yes.
Yes. Previously, the previous summits were concentrated on the situation in the Eastern Europe around Russia and Ukraine. That means NATO is still keeping the same goal. But this year, the countries are mostly concentrating on the situation in the Middle East, where the Russian presence is not that much significant. Does it mean that NATO also changed its priorities and it's no longer only about Russia?
I think NATO ought to change its priorities, but I'm not the General Secretary of NATO. I'm not a member of NATO. I live in a NATO country, perhaps the most important NATO country. But as somebody who follows global events and is a student of history, I think the alliance needs to consider how warfare has changed, where the centers of conflict are, what the priorities are. Do we really need Ukraine to be a NATO nation? for example, since it provokes the Russians and doesn't necessarily make NATO any stronger. In fact, it may make NATO weaker. What do we do about the flood of Muslims into Europe? Do we need to do anything about it, first of all? Secondly, does it pose a strategic threat to Europe as we want Europe to be, to the freedoms that Europe enjoys? Some people would argue it does. Some people will argue it doesn't. These are issues that the NATO members themselves need to be talking about. They need to be saying, where do we focus our time and effort? Because I will tell you that I think NATO's important. I want to preserve the alliance. I want to transform it into something with a 21st century mission, not a latter half of the 20th century mission. But there are a lot of my countrymen here in the United States who would just as soon let NATO go away, and that we not spend the kind of money providing a defensive umbrella for the European countries, and that we spend that money here in the United States.
Well, that's indeed
That's a political reality that has to be dealt with.
I will say that's one of the key points. The position of NATO, its mission, actually started to change since the time when Donald Trump was elected as 47th President of the United States of America. Does it mean that the priorities of the alliance will be changed in accordance with who is taking place in the White House?
Well, the priority of NATO is the protection of the North Atlantic Alliance, which is basically the United States and Canada married to the European countries. That's the purpose of NATO. Now, what we have to do is figure out what the threats are to that alliance and how those threats are best met, how the potential enemies are challenged, how they are defended against. If you think that the infiltration of Europe by militant Islamists seeking to conduct acts of terror, NATO ought to address that. If you think the threat is cyber warfare coming from potentially anywhere, but let's just say China, NATO needs to address that. It needs to have a plan. They need to share information and work together. Because I will tell you, I think right now, the bigger threat to Western Europe, even to Eastern Europe, isn't Russian weapons of war coming into the continent. It's Russian energy supplies being kept out of the continent. That Putin will use energy to blackmail Eastern and Western Europe into doing his bidding. And so NATO ought to focus on an energy liberation strategy, which is different from the focus on solar and wind that the Green parties of the left have forced on socialist governments in France, in England, in Germany.
Mr. Rov, given NATO's complicated history in the region, I mean the Middle East itself, how can the alliance play a positive and stabilizing role in the region without repeating the mistakes it had previously?
Number one, I think the Europeans, the NATO nations, need to follow a policy of economic engagement that models what President Trump has tried to stimulate with the Abraham Accords. Prosperous countries don't go to war. No one wants to disrupt prosperity. War destroys prosperity. War destroys productivity. So countries that are prosperous don't make war. Germany was flat on its back when the Nazis came to power, and they used state spending to stimulate the military sector so they could have the illusion of prosperity while making war on their neighbors. the nations of the NATO alliance need to make sure that the countries in the Middle East are so prosperous that they wouldn't dream of making war on one another.
So
I think that's an achievable goal. I think the window to start is small and we have to move now, but I think it's an achievable goal.
coming back to the situation between Iran and Israel, recent escalation, I would say, even the war between two countries and United States involvement. How do you think, do Western leaders truly understand how deeply embedded Tehran in the regional power structure, or they are underestimating Iran's position in the region and the consequences it may lead for?
I think they understand it. I think some of them ignore it for their own economic advantage because they want to sell weapons to Iran, they want to trade with Iran. They ignore it. But again, they ignore it at their peril because a nuclear-armed Iran is a threat to Eastern and Western Europe. It's a threat to Russia. It's a threat to China. It's a threat to the Arab states. It's a threat to the United States. It changes the calculations. I'm not sure every European leader understands that.
What about the consequences if NATO decide to involve into the Middle East? Recent escalation, don't you think that Iran and its allies may respond in accordance?
Well, first of all, who are Iran's allies? I haven't seen anybody stepping up in their defense lately. Even Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is a creation of the Iranian security state, said, we're sitting this out. We're not involved. We're not taking sides. Even Hezbollah. Okay, so I don't think Iran has very many friends right now. And that's important. The Western European countries and some of the Eastern European countries, the ones where the free market has taken hold and they are enjoying prosperity, have an opportunity to share their economic resources with Iran, not as aid, not as charity, but by doing business. There's a market there to be opened to consumer goods. They have energy supplies that the Europeans would love to have. It's an easy trip across the Persian Gulf, into the Mediterranean, up through Eastern Europe, oil, natural gas, so they don't have to depend on supplies coming from Putin's Russia. So he can't threaten to turn the heat off in the winter.
But at the same time,
this is worth pursuing.
At the same time, Donald Trump doesn't exclude the possibility of having a direct talks with Iran when it comes to its nuclear further developments, right?
Well, he didn't exclude it before Saturday. I think the question now is whether Iran attempts to resume a nuclear program or reconstruct a nuclear program, because despite what's being leaked into the American press, I choose to believe that Fordow and the other facilities have been destroyed beyond repair.
So
it's what the Times of Israel is reporting. It's the position of the Trump administration. The American media does not want Trump to have a victory, and so they will downplay the success of the raid on the nuclear. It's an editorial. I think it's bad journalism. I think it's bad for the world, but it's what they've chosen to do. And so Iran no longer has a nuclear program to negotiate away. They may still have a small stockpile of enriched uranium that is tradable for something, and I hope they would trade that.
one of the key elements for discussion at this summit in Hague is NATO's increase in defense spending. Donald Trump insists on 5% of GDP, and it seems that some countries in Europe are willing to follow this new strategy. Publicly, there is a unity. Privately, France and Germany, for example, reportedly oppose escalation in the Middle East and saying that they can achieve the desired 5% in near future. But the situation is totally different in eastern part of Europe, who mostly rely on support from the West. Therefore, is NATO still an alliance or just a group of countries pretending they share the interests?
Oh, it's an alliance with shared interests, and no one should think otherwise. People want to do different things, but we're not reporting that after 10 years, Donald Trump can declare victory in his campaign to pressure NATO to spend more, to demonstrate that NATO is important to the European members as it is important to the United States. Trump's position was, I think, distorted. And it was simply that NATO can't be more important to America than it is to the countries of Europe. Don't expect us to spend all of this money on your defense so that you can divert defense spending into social welfare programs and into green energy programs, because we'll save the day if the Russians do something. You have to prepare to defend yourself too. The recognition that they have to increase their defense spending to the levels that they committed to spend is a victory for Trump, and people need to understand that. I think it also holds the alliance together. The more you spend on something, the more important you consider it. You pay more attention to a meal that costs $100 than you do to a meal that costs $20. You take more time to eat it, you take more time to savor it, you take more time to enjoy it. Well, NATO, if we're spending more money on NATO, we're going to expect it to do more. We're going to take it more seriously. We're going to think seriously about its mission.
Just recently, United States framed it clearly that the recent deployments, it was a preventive deterrence. But where there is a red line, is there a clear definition of when diplomacy ends and NATO steps in military?
No, there isn't. I don't think with the current president of the United States that there's ever a red line. And if there is, Mr. Trump is the only one who knows where it is, and he's not going to tell you, because he wants you to think that various things might be red lines. And he wants you to volunteer. If you're in a negotiation, he wants you to volunteer to give up things that you have in order to get things that you want, or to avoid crossing what you may think is the red line. It's a negotiation strategy. Get the other guy to give up more while I'm giving up less, because he thinks I have to have something. And I don't really have to have it at all. So in total, Trump is all about the win. Everything is a negotiation, and he always has to win. And that's what he's thinking about when he's negotiating with Iran. That's what he's expecting Steve Witkoff to be doing when he's talking to Hamas. Go for the win. So we're going for the win. And the win here is the continued reliance and mutual protection of the NATO countries for each other. That nobody can come in and divide Europe again. Not between East and West, not between France and Germany, not between England and continental Europe. No divisions, one mind, mutual defense, because we all basically agree on human rights, political liberty, economic security.
That indeed very interesting. Previously answering my question about Iran and NATO countries, you mentioned that there are still countries in Europe who are willing to continue cooperation with Iran because of some economic benefits. This summit declaration reaffirms Article number 5, but in a multipolar world, how realistic is NATO's promise of collective defense?
Well, I hope we never have to find out. I'm not at all convinced that Article 5 in the 21st century, with so many countries in NATO, will be honored in the same way it would have been under President Truman or under President Eisenhower or even under President Kennedy.
Well, and one more question I have. Let's talk about the public opinion. After decades of war in Iraq, Afghanistan, do you think the voters in NATO countries have the willingness for their countries to participate in another potential long-term military engagement in the Middle East?
They certainly don't in the United States, which is why President Trump first made clear that under his America First policy, which he gets to define, not all of the pundits running around saying they're part of his movement, like Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon, that stopping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon is America First policy. It is an American strategic interest. Okay, first thing. Second thing, the attacks were on the Iranian nuclear program. They were not on the Iranian government. They were not on the Iranian people. They were on the nuclear program with the intention of destroying it, which I believe has been done. Trump has been very clear to pull back on Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, when he talks about the need for regime change. If there's going to be a change in the regime in Tehran, it's up to the Iranian people to bring it about. Now, if they start something, will they get help? Probably. Whether that help is overt or covert, I can't say country by country, but I think the world generally thinks long-term prospects for peace are better if the guys who run Iran now are in prison for crimes against humanity and there's a small d democratic government in its place, as fragile as it might be. But Trump was very clear that regime change wasn't on the table, that this wasn't a forever war, that we were in and we were out. And in fact, we were in and out in 18 hours.
Well, Mr. Rove, thank you. Thank you so much for joining Inside Politics.
Sure thing. Always happy to be with you.
Thank you. So that's all for this edition of Inside Politics. The NATO summit in The Hague has made one thing clear. Global security priorities are evolving, and so is the alliance role in addressing them. With the Middle East back in sharp focus and Ukraine's spotlight dimmed, NATO finds itself navigating a complex new landscape. We'll continue to monitor developments across the region and bring you the voices shaping policy and diplomacy in real time. I'm Anastasia Lavrina.